Jim McElvey, pick it up, Mikey.
In a decade of transition, these noble warriors blazed a trail for future stars. Men who would someday also race the Indy 500 and remember their courage. Hi everyone, I'm Bob Jenkins, and welcome to a review of the Indy 500s during the 1960s, a program we will call Decade of Courage. And who better to be with us than Donald Davidson, who's the historian at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And boy, we've come a long way in 35 years. The car here behind me won the race in 1960. Looks a lot different from the cars we see on the track today.
They were the front-engine cars. They called them roadsters. Rear-engine cars had been at the track in the 1930s, but they hadn't been around for a while, and the first one would show up the year after this. But 150 miles an hour hadn't been turned yet. You could see the drivers. They were all Americans, and they came up through the sprints and midgets, and people dressed differently in those days. The crew cuts were very popular, the flat tops, and people would wear white slacks and T-shirts and white socks and loafers.
As I recall, though, we came very close to a 150 mile an hour lap in 1960.
Yes, and that was a surprise. I mean, everybody was sort of looking for 150 eventually, but after Eddie Sachs won the pole at, I think, a high 146, you thought, well, it's a couple of years away. And then Jim Hurtubise almost pulled it off on the last qualifying day.
I remember 1960 because it was my first race. We sat in grandstand C, and I remember looking up toward turn number 4. It seemed like almost every lap in the second half to see whether Roger Ward or Jim Rathman was going to lead that lap.
That was a phenomenal battle, and in fact, there was 29 changes of lead in the race. They changed the lead 14 times between them in the last half alone, and that wasn't because of pit stop shuffles. They used to go the distance on 3 pit stops, so that would probably only 1 or 2 stops in the last half.
And who won? Well, we'll show you as you look at highlights of the 1960 Indianapolis 500. The year is 1960, considered by many to be the best, most competitive race ever run at Indianapolis. Jim Rathman starts from the front row between Eddie Sachs and Roger Ward. From the first lap, this race is tremendous. Ward, Johnny Thompson, Sachs, and Troy Ruttman put on a racing exhibition, trading the lead with no one car dominating. Lap 95, and Rathman takes the lead, beginning perhaps the greatest 2-car race ever witnessed at Indianapolis, as he and Roger Ward battle back and forth for over 250 miles. Driving nearly identical Watson-built cars, tire wear soon becomes a major factor in the race.
Roger could get me coming out of the corner and down the straightaway. And I could pass him, actually, or going into the corner or through the corner where I could outrun Roger. And I'm trying to save my tires. That was a main thing that you had to do in those days.
I realized that if I continued in this kind of a battle with Rathman, that the tires were not going to go the distance. So I made a decision to back off and let Rathman lead. Well, that was working perfectly. But I failed to get cooperation from the car that was running third. That was Johnny Thompson.
With the leaders now forced to run even harder, tire wear becomes even worse. 10 laps to go. Rathman leads. Ward takes over on lap 194. With just 3 laps to go, the right front cord comes through the tire on Ward's car, forcing him to slow down, giving Rathman both the lead and his first Indianapolis 500 victory.
History would report that that particular race was perhaps one of the most competitive.
Man, I was happy. Figured this was finally it. I finally got lucky and won one.
Establishing new records with an average speed of nearly 139 miles per hour and total winnings of $110,000, Jim Rathman outduels Roger Ward to capture his only Indy 500 victory. Great victory for Jim Rathbun. You talk about things that are different from nowadays. It didn't take nearly as much money to run a team back then.
No, I think first place prize money in 1960 was about $110,000, and Jim Rathbun told me a couple of years ago they had $35,000 in their whole operation. And I can't remember if they had one or two engines, but it was a brand new chassis, and in fact that included the trailer that they towed it with.
I'll be darned. 1961, and tragically the Speedway lost one of its great drivers, Tony Bettenhausen, the day before the first day of time trials. But then there was also a very strange-looking creation running around the track. Tell us about that.
And it was painted green, which upset a few people at the time. Yeah, it's an English Cooper Climax with Jack Brabham, the Australian, the world champion of the previous 2 years. And they had modified a Grand Prix car to run at Indianapolis.
And how did it do? Well, we will see. Here again, the highlights from the 1961 Indy 500. Chief Mechanic George Bignotti and the Beau Seal Fast Team arrive at Indianapolis in 1961 as defending national champions. A.J. Foyt is their driver. While Jack Brabham's new rear-engine Cooper Climax qualifies 13th fastest, the competition for the pole is fierce, with several drivers eyeing the magic 150 miles per hour barrier. Eddie Sachs comes the closest, taking the pole with an average speed of better than 147 miles per hour. It's a clean start, and Jim Hurtubise takes the early lead. Pole-sitter Sachs runs second, while Jim Rathbun, rookie Parnelli Jones, and A.J. Foyt complete the top 5. Lap 49, and Don Davis spins on the main stretch, starting a wild chain reaction. Jack Turner flips end over end. Amazingly, no one is seriously injured. For Turner, it's the beginning of 3 straight years of frustration. It soon becomes a two-man race between A.J. Foyt and Eddie Sachs. Foyt leads on lap 157 when Sachs pits. 3 laps later, Foyt pulls in for his planned final stop. Returning to the track, Foyt immediately begins gaining on Sachs. Lap 170 now, and Foyt regains the lead. Sachs is having trouble keeping up, but it's Foyt who's in trouble. His speed advantage is a result of not taking on enough fuel to finish because the refueling mechanism has failed.
Foyt's very sharp. He knew something wasn't right. The car was running faster than normal.
Not knowing that Foyt will have to stop, Sachs runs hard, putting excessive wear on his tires. 16 laps from the finish, Foyt makes an emergency stop for fuel, giving the lead back to Sachs. Just 3 laps from the finish, Sachs is forced to stop for new tires, and Foyt is back in control. A.J. Foyt takes the checkered flag for his first win at the Brickyard. An emotional victory for the native Texan.
I had tears running down my eyes. It was just unbelievable.
The question will be asked forever. Should Eddie Sachs have come in? If he didn't come in, would he have won the race?
Well, those that think that he should have stayed out, Clint Brawner was one. The cords were showing through, but the fact that he had, I think, like an 11 or 12-second lead on Foyt, there are those that felt that he could have slowed down and still been able to cruise over and win. But who knows? It could have let go in the last lap, and he could have hit the wall.
And a few changes at the track also after the race. They paved the straightaway.
Yes, the whole track had been paved by World War II, except for the main straightaway, and there was a concentrated effort to have the bricks still on view. But by that time, it was getting very rough, and now with the rear-engine cars coming in and the suspensions, that they thought, well, maybe the time has come. So in the fall, down went the asphalt.
And 1962 is up next as we continue to review the 1960s at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. I'm Bob Jenkins. Welcome back to Decade of Courage as we review the 1960s at the Indianapolis 500. Donald Davidson is with me. In 1962, the magic mark of 150 was finally achieved. Parnelli Jones did it. How did he do it?
Well, he discovered something when he was a rookie in the 1961 race, and he was very cagey. And he got into a slide, and as he got up near the wall, he punched the throttle, and he felt something in the back. He thought that maybe he was projected forward somehow. So he got on the tire test program that summer, and he thought, I'm going to try something out. And what he did was to go into a deliberate slide through every turn, and then he would punch the throttle coming off the turn. And his theory was that the right rear tire would bend under in the slide, and when he applied the throttle, that the tire would pop up and project him forward. And so what he did was perfected that on every turn, and told nobody what he was doing, including the tire engineers and Jim Hurtubise, who was his very best friend. And I think it was a couple of years before drivers in practice would come in from the turns and say, "Parnelli, I think we finally figured out what you've been doing."
Did Parnelli Jones win the 1962 Indy 500? Here are the highlights. For 1962, Parnelli Jones sits on the pole in a car they call Old Calhoun. A 2-year-old Watson Roadster making its 3rd straight Indy 500 start. Roger Ward lines up next to him in the middle of the front row, a tick below Parnelli's 150-mile-per-hour pole-sitting effort. Most feel Parnelli is unbeatable.
You know that he's going to go for the lead, and he did. And quite frankly, we really were not a match for him.
The race gets underway with Parnelli dominating. For the 2nd straight year, Jack Turner gets airborne. Bobby Grimm spins but is okay. And A.J. Foyt loses a wheel. The wheel won't quit, and neither will A.J. Foyt climbs into Paul Russo's machine as a relief driver. But on this day, no one is a match for Parnelli. He dominates the first half of the race, leading 120 of the first 125 laps. But Parnelli is in trouble. Roger Ward is slowly cutting into Parnelli's lead. And by lap 125, Jones is leading the race without any brakes.
All of a sudden, somebody spun or something in turn 2, and I backed off and hit the brakes, and the pedal went clear to the floor. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do?
I knew as I began to gain on him that he obviously had some kind of problem. Now, I didn't know exactly what it was at that time.
While Parnelli loses valuable time in the pits, Ward builds a solid lead over leader car teammate Lynn Sutton and goes on to register the 2nd Indianapolis 500-mile victory of his career.
The victory was even all the sweeter because of having won it a 2nd time.
So Roger Ward wins his 2nd in 1962, but you have an interesting story about how he thinks that really Parnelli deserved to win that race?
Yes, he says absolutely that he inherited the race, and that was Parnelli's. And he said if he rated all his races at the Speedway, his best was 1960 when he finished 2nd.
Interesting. All right, we'll be back with more Decade of Courage, the 1960s at the Indy 500 right after this. Welcome back to Decade of Courage as we review the Indianapolis 500s during the 1960s. I'm Bob Jenkins along with Donald Davidson. We're up to 1963, and by now we're really beginning to see an influx of rear-engine cars and some foreign drivers.
I think the tire companies probably had something to do with that. There was all of a sudden a lot of money available, but there was diversity in the field, and it added another dimension. A lot of the interest was centered around the Lotus team, the Colin Chapman and the English Lotuses, with Ford engines that were factory-backed, and Jim Clark and Dan Gurney. And the Fords, the first year, just that year only, they were pushrod engines that had Weber carburetors. And so Jim Clark and Dan Gurney actually were the last people to run in carburation runs with carburetors.
They still use the term, but no more carburetors. All right, was it a rear-engine car or an old Roadster that would win the 1963 Indy 500? Let's take a look. 1963 brings a taste of Europe and a lot of talk about Colin Chapman's Ford-powered rear-engine Lotus machines. Andy Granatelli's revitalized Novi's also catch the attention of many. But as practice begins, the focus turns once again to Parnelli Jones in his reliable old number 98. Four more drivers break the 150-mile-per-hour barrier in qualifying, with Parnelli firmly on the pole with both new 1- and 4-lap records. The race begins, Parnelli Jones taking the lead into the first turn. But before the first lap is complete, Jim Hurtubise's supercharged Novi has taken the lead. The race is barely 2 laps old when rookie Bobby Unser bangs the southwest wall. An ominous debut for a driver who will eventually win this race 3 times. Leading the race on lap 63, Parnelli pits for the first time, and the lead goes to Jim Clark and the Lotus. Quickly, Parnelli is back on the track, but he can't catch Clark. The European champion holds the lead until pitting on lap 95. Late in the race, Parnelli's lead over Clark is tight, when suddenly Clark starts to drop back. Parnelli's car is losing oil. The black flag is considered but never thrown, and the problem soon subsides.
What happened, the tank being on the left side, all the oil was pouring off on the left rear tire. But where the tank broke, it was broke right above the center of the tank. As soon as that oil level dropped reasonably below that point, it quit dumping the oil out of there.
Eddie Sachs loses a wheel and spins for a second time as Parnelli's oil controversy continues to boil.
With a spray of oil coming out of Parnelli's car, you flog, mister.
The track was oily, kind of oily toward the last half of the race anyhow.
It's true that Parnelli did lose some oil. But when a guy is leading the race, you better be damn sure that you're right if you're going to throw the black flag at him.
The last lap, and Roger McCluskey spins as Parnelli tries to pass. Jones survives the incident and cruises home to a 30-second victory over Jim Clark. The win marks Parnelli's only Indianapolis 500-mile victory, while rookie Jim Clark's second-place finish highlights a triumphant debut for the new rear-engine entry. And so old Calhoun went to victory lane in 1963, the car that's sitting right behind Donald. When they're making 10 pit stops nowadays, they only made one, or at least Jim Clark did back then?
Yeah, Parnelli made 3, Jim Clark made 1.
Unbelievable. I remember Jack Turner having a problem in 1963, don't I?
Yes, you do. It was the practice session of the second qualifying day, and he had this horrendous accident with a front engine car. And the poor fellow had crashed in 61 and 62, and that's what everybody remembers him for, and yet he was a very accomplished race driver. So he was in the infield hospital, and his good friend Johnny Boyd went over to see him, thinking that he must be very badly injured, and he was sitting up on the cot in the hospital and said, "I quit."
And he never raced again.
He never raced again.
All right, the revolution is still going on. When would we have a rear engine car in victory lane? Well, we'll continue with our Decade of Courage in just a moment. Welcome back to Decade of Courage. 1964 arrives, and still we have not seen a rear-engine car in victory lane, but they were becoming even more popular, weren't they?
I think there was a dozen in the race, but what happened was it was decision time because you had a choice of tire, and the tire companies were spending a lot of money trying to get drivers under contract, and a lot of the teams didn't know what to do, so they would have a front-engine car and a rear engine, and then during practice you'd make a decision which way you were going to go.
Firestone had pretty much dominated, but now Goodyear was beginning to come into the racing.
Yes, indeed. In fact, in 63 and 64, they were there in practice, and in fact withdrew before the race both times.
All right, let's take a look at the highlights of the 1964 Indy 500. Indeed, by 1964, many teams contemplate switching to the rear-engine cars. Jim Clark puts Colin Chapman's rear-engine Lotus on the pole with new 1- and 4-lap records. But most are not prepared for what lay around the corner on race day. To nobody's surprise, Jim Clark pulls ahead of the pack at the start, leading at the end of 1. On lap 2, an incident that will forevermore change the face of IndyCar racing. Coming through turn 4, Dave McDonald slides into the northwest inside retaining wall. Eddie Sachs hits McDonald from behind. With a full load of gasoline on board, both cars explode on impact. The race is red flagged. Sachs and McDonald lose their lives.
It was a very sad moment. There were some very great race drivers lost their lives. I'll never forget on the restart where it happened, and you kept running through the cement dust and things like that. It went through your mind that could have been you.
The race resumes. On lap 48, Jimmy Clark's suspension brakes coming down the main stretch. He pulls into the grass in turn 1. Parnelli Jones assumes the lead with A.J. Foyt in pursuit. Jones pits on lap 55, and A.J. Foyt is in the lead. Coming out of the pits, Jones' fuel tank catches fire. Parnelli escapes with only minor burns, but is through for the day. Foyt takes advantage of Jones' mishap, making a stop without losing his lead over 2-time winner Roger Ward. With Ward making 5 stops for fuel, Foyt leads easily, even lapping Ward near the finish. Foyt takes the checkered flag for his second Indy 500 win, the last win for a front-engine car of any kind at Indianapolis. Foyt's victory is tarnished by the tragedy of the afternoon.
It was a tragic race. I think it took a lot out of it for me. I think what made '64 such a banner year for me, that we come back and won the rest of the races. I was glad to be a 2-time winner. Just could not believe it, but at the same time, it was really dampened by the loss of some of the other good race drivers.
So make it win number 2 for A.J. Foyt at the Indy 500. There were a lot of new safety regulations that were adopted after that tragic crash early in '64.
Yeah, both of those cars used gasoline, and you could not use gasoline anymore. It's been methanol ever since. And then also fuel cells were introduced the following year, and during the next 2 or 3 years there were quite a few safety innovations that were put into force.
We talked about the Goodyear Firestone thing, and you have an interesting story regarding A.J. Foyt.
Well, a number of drivers were contracted on Goodyear, but right before the first qualifying day, they said, we need more time, we are going to withdraw for this month. And they released everybody to run Firestones. Foyt was a contract Goodyear driver and evidently had some kind of a disagreement with Firestone. And so, although he won the race on their tires, when he stands up in victory lane, he's wearing a Goodyear uniform. They don't do that anymore.
No. We'll be back with more. Take a look at 1965 when we return with Decade of Courage. We've reached the year 1965 as we look back on the Indy 500s that were run during the 1960s. Now, Donald, in 1965, I recall, again, there were a lot of foreign drivers in rear-engine cars, but there was also a foreign-born man who was racing here in the United States that made his first appearance at the Speedway.
Mario Andretti, of course, and I would say that he was about as highly touted a rookie as anybody that's come in. Now, there's always somebody that sort of emerges in the race, but going in, it was almost like Nigel Mansell, almost to that point. Everybody in practice was talking about Mario.
Well, he had certainly run well in the championship series before coming to Indianapolis. So let's look back now and decide whether or not, first of all, Mario is going to do well in the race, but secondly, we still have not had a rear-engine winner in the 500. Let's see what happens. For 1965, the evolution continues as more rear-engine cars are entered than ever before. Several of the new designs are highly competitive, but Colin Chapman's Lotuses are still the class of the field.
Colin Chapman, for me, was the most creative designer in the history of motorsport at any time, in any period, throughout its entire history.
In qualifying, Mario Andretti breaks Jim Clark's one-year-old track records. Clark counters by becoming the first driver in history to break the 160-mile-per-hour barrier, temporarily replacing Andretti as the pole sitter. Last year's winner, A.J. Foyt, tops them both with a pole position average of better than 161. When the green flag flies, Jim Clark surges ahead of the pack going into turn 1. Clark leads the first lap, but Foyt slips by on lap 2. Clark regains the lead on lap 3 and slowly stretches his lead over Foyt. Lap 17, and Lloyd Ruby spins in turn 3. Almost simultaneously, Lynn Sutton spins and continues, adding drama to a race that Clark is leading handily. Clark widens his lead as Foyt drops back. And on lap 115, A.J. calls it a day, the victim of gearbox problems. With Foyt out of the running, Clark dominates and the race is for second. Crossing the finish line 2 laps ahead of second place Parnelli Jones, Jim Clark becomes the first foreign driver to win the race since Dario Resta did it back in 1916.
That was a big deal for a European to go and win the Indianapolis 500 for us as Europeans. And that's what fired everyone else's interest to even thinking of going there.
Mario Andretti finishes third, capturing Rookie of the Year honors in the process. With Clark in victory lane, the British have successfully conquered the 500 just 3 years after returning to Indianapolis. 1965, Jim Clark the winner, Mario Andretti Rookie of the Year. The first 4 finishers were Fords. I don't remember 65 too well because I was on my senior high school trip in Washington, D.C., but nevertheless, it was a very safe race in 65. Were you?
Yes. Well, you know, Bud Tinkelstead was the only wall contact, and it was a great relief to everybody because after the previous year, everybody was kind of on tender hooks, and you couldn't. It's probably the safest race that there's ever been.
So the rear-engine revolution had finally hit big time. A rear-engine car in victory lane, and we will see how they do down the line here as we continue with our Decade of Courage, a look back at the Indy 500s during the 1960s. Welcome back to Decade of Courage. I'm Bob Jenkins along with Donald Davidson, and 1966 is the featured year now, and for those of us who love these old roadsters, we were really sad in 1966 because they were the cars that were almost extinct.
In fact, there was only one in the field. Bobby Grimm drove the only front-engine car in the race. Now, they would have, it would be a couple more years before they were gone completely, but the days are numbered.
So, obviously, a rear-engine car is going to win the 1966 Indy 500, but which one of them? Let's take a look. In 1966, Jim Clark is joined at Indy by fellow Scotsman Jackie Stewart and Formula One world champion Graham Hill from England. Hill and Stewart are brought in as teammates to two-time Indy champ Roger Ward. The new drivers are immediately accepted.
Only the A.J. Foyts or the Parnelli Jones or the Andrettis were given as much exposure as Graham and Jimmy and I. And we didn't really warrant it in a funny sort of way because we hadn't served our apprenticeship.
Graham Hill has very little oval track experience, but qualifies a respectable 15th. Rookie Jackie Stewart is 11th fastest, while Jim Clark qualifies second quick. Second-year sensation Mario Andretti sits on the pole with a new track record, some 4.5 miles an hour faster than the old mark. As the field rolls off, the drivers are apprehensive about the start.
I was nervous about doing the 500 because when I went to do the 500, you go on British television, Jackie Stewart, Graham Hill and Jim Clark are going to do the Indy 500, and you go on television, an evening talk show or a sports show, and all they do is show the crashes. These enormous accidents, and this is what you're going to do?
Stewart's apprehensions prove well-founded. Coming down for the green flag, nearly half the field is involved in this opening lap crash. 11 cars are eliminated. Amazingly, the only injury occurs as A.J. Foyt cuts himself trying to climb the fence, fleeing the incident. It's lap 65 now, and leader Jim Clark spins in turn 4, regains control, and ducks into the pits for a fresh set of tires. Clark is back in the lead on lap 87 when he spins for a second time. Again, he regains control. Lloyd Ruby leads when he develops an oiling problem and is black flagged at the three-quarter mark. As Ruby pits, Jackie Stewart assumes the lead, with Clark and Hill running second and third. The British are dominating. Ten laps to go now, and Stewart suddenly slows to a stop at the head of the main straight. To the delight of the crowd, he begins pushing his car toward the finish line, hoping to get credit for another lap.
This has seemed to attract the attention of the public in a fairly dramatic fashion because they thought this was an enormous act of bravery for some reason, which it not at all was. And I pushed the car back for as far as I could until I was told that I could push it no further.
With Stewart out, Graham Hill leads the final 10 laps, taking the checkered flag ahead of second-place Clark. Jackie Stewart finishes 6th and is awarded Rookie of the Year honors. Hill's victory gives the British back-to-back wins at Indy. Graham Hill, as a rookie, wins the race in 1966. Give me the historical background on that, the rookie winners at Indianapolis.
He was only the 6th, and of course this is Damon Hill's father, but it was the first rookie winner since 1927, unless you include Louis Meyer from 1928. It was his first start, but he had driven relief in the 1927 race.
And the answer to the great trivia question, the last driver to go over the wall in Indianapolis, the answer is A.J. Foyt, because he climbed over the wall in that first lap crash. But that was something that really depleted the field there in the early going of that event.
Yes, in fact, exactly 1/3 of the entire field was taken out before they ever got to the first turn. When the race restarted, there was only 22 cars left.
The British invasion is in full swing now. Graham Hill wins in 1966. We'll continue with 1967 on Decade of Courage in a moment. Welcome back to Decade of Courage, a look back at the Indianapolis 500's run during the 1960s. I'm Bob Jenkins. We're up to 1967, and Donald Davidson, at that time, rear-engine cars had won the last 2 years. Foreign drivers had won the last 2 years. The Americans had to come up with something, and they came up with this contraption behind us here. It's sort of a sidecar, and the engine is a turbine. Now, how did this all come about?
This was a man named Ken Wallace had this design, and he went to Andy Granatelli, and Andy liked to jump on anything that was different and innovative. And it's actually aircraft-type construction, and the driver cockpit is on the right-hand side, and the Pratt & Whitney gas turbine engines on the left-hand side. It had four-wheel drive. It had an air flap which would come up, and in those days you'd have to slow down for the turns and brake for the turns. So when the driver applied the brake, up came the air flap. And then there was another secret weapon in there as well, the driver, Parnelli Jones.
Right. Well, did he win? Let's find out as we take a look at the 1967 500. For 1967, a new car is unveiled. With the proven durability of a turbine engine and the superior handling of four-wheel drive, Andy Granatelli's new creation is innovative, revolutionary, and controversial. In qualifications, the car is adequate but not spectacular. With the 6th fastest time, Parnelli will start on the outside of the second row, his worst starting position in 7 years at Indianapolis.
They assumed that I was sandbagging, that I was backing off the throttle, and which I wasn't.
I know that they were sandbagging, that he had so much more that he must have been embarrassed by it, but so it was not even a contest.
At the start, Parnelli ducks inside of Mario Andretti and wheels the turbine into the lead. By the end of the first lap, he has run away from the field. But this year's race will be a 2-day event, as rain stops the contest after only 18 laps. The next day, Parnelli is lapping the slower cars and building his lead. No one can catch him. Suddenly on lap 52, Leroy Yarborough spins in front of Parnelli. Jones hits the brakes and avoids the trouble. Leading at will, Parnelli is on his way to victory number 2. 4 laps to go now, when the crowd is stunned. After thoroughly dominating the field, a broken bearing drops Parnelli to 6th place.
Just going down the back straightaway, all of a sudden it just, like he took it out of gear. And that was it. It just was sickening.
On the final lap, a multiple car pileup creates havoc in turn 4. Somehow, A.J. Foyt makes his way through the smoke and takes the checkered flag. The 3rd time in the last 7 years that Foyt has called Victory Lane home. So A.J. Foyt wins and Al Unser finishes in 2nd position. Tell me about the premonition that Foyt supposedly had on the last lap.
Yeah, Foyt says that he had an idea that something was going to happen, so he began to slow down, and then when he came through turn 4 and saw everything happening up in front of him, then he had time to take evasive action. But I can just remember it like it was yesterday, watching him pick his way through the debris at whatever speed it was, but actually gearing up, went up through several gears on his way down to take the checkered flag.
And I can still hear the public address announcer, Tom Carnegie, shouting, "Did he get through? Did he get through?" And he did get through to win the 67 500. 1968 is next when we come back with Decade of Courage. This is Decade of Courage as we review the Indianapolis 500s that were run in the 1960s. I'm Bob Jenkins along with Donald Davidson. We're up to 1968. Parnelli Jones retires during the month, but there's another strange-looking car. The second version of the turbine was actually a wedge-shaped car.
Yes, it was Lotus. Maurice Philippe designed those cars, and it was a tragic period. Jim Clark was supposed to be the lead driver. He lost his life in a Formula 2 accident in Hockenheim, Germany. Jackie Stewart was to be his replacement, and he had an injury, a cracked wrist from the Spanish Grand Prix, so he couldn't compete. And so they put their number 2 driver, Grand Prix driver, into action, Mike Spence. He lost his life, and so it was a pretty bad time. Joe Leonard was hired onto the team and then won the pole with teammate Graham Hill next to him.
How did they do in the race? Let's find out as we check out 1968 at Indy. Bobby Unser arrives in Indianapolis in 1968 sporting a new Gurney Eagle chassis, the only serious threat to Granatelli's turbine-powered Lotuses. In qualifications, two of the turbines, Joe Leonard and Graham Hill, break the 171 barrier. Unser settles for the outside of the front row with a 4-lap average just below 170. The turbines again look strong.
Early on, I knew they were going to take off. And when we came down for the start and they just didn't take off and annihilate me, I thought, what in the world have they done wrong? They've made some drastic mistake. And then all of a sudden, I discovered that I have a tremendous advantage in traffic. That's where they should have had their advantage.
Unser uses his handling advantage to dominate early, while Leonard struggles in traffic. Al Unser breaks a wheel and crashes on lap 41. Arnie Knepper and Gary Bettenhausen are victims of Unser's debris. Later in the race, Bobby loses his lower gears, making acceleration extremely difficult. His pit stops will be costly. Unser will need nearly 3/4 of a lap to regain racing speed. Leonard's turbine wedge leads with Unser running second when Carl Williams crashes on lap 183, bringing out the yellow. Under the yellow, the drivers must hold their positions. Art Pollard, Leonard's teammate, slows, lengthening the position on the track between the first place Leonard and the second place Unser.
If I pass him, I get disqualified. And so the crowd was making so much noise, I can hear it in the race car, it's so much noise.
To the crowd's amazement, Joe Leonard suddenly slows as the green flag flies, the result of a flameout. The second straight year that Andy Granatelli's machines have fallen out while leading with less than 10 laps to go. Bobby Unser takes the checkered flag in record time, the first of 3 wins at Indy for Bobby, and the first of many more for the illustrious Unser family.
I've never seen so many people stand up and hit the floor and make so much noise in all my life. Tony Holman said it was the greatest 500 that he'd ever seen.
So for the second year in a row, the turbines run well during most of the race and have a problem right at the very end. But Bobby Unser wins, giving the Unser family the first of many victories at Indy.
Yeah, Bobby was sort of the knight in shining armor that year, and he'd had a problem where he lost all the gears but the top gear, so he had a devil of a time getting out of the pits.
And as I recall, for those of us, again, who love the Roadsters, 1968 was the very last one.
Jim Hurtubise had one in the show, and I think he burned a piston after 9 laps or something, and when they pushed that one away, that was the last one-engine car you'd ever see on race day.
So Bobby Unser wins the 1968 Indy 500. We are up to the final year of the 1960s decade, and we'll review the 69 500 after this.
The 500, the 500, the greatest race in the world. From the opening ball till the race is done.
This is Decade of Courage, reviewing the Indianapolis 500s during the 1960s. We're up to 1969, Donald. And as I recall, there was a crash that occurred in practice in 1969 that was very significant in the outcome of the race.
Yes, in fact, the first qualifying weekend had been rained out, and we all expected Mario to be on the pole by then with the 4-wheel drive car. But during practice between the 2 weeks with no qualifiers yet, he had a horrendous accident and just completely destroyed that 4-wheel drive Lotus.
And they had to go to the old Bronner Hawk to compete in the race.
Yes, it had one at Hanford, and they had entered it, but they didn't even plan to run it.
We'll see if Mario Andretti can win the 1969 500. Here are the highlights.
For 1969, Mario Andretti merges with the STP Corporation and Andy Granatelli. The practice crash destroys Andretti's new Lotus. The backup machine, the old reliable Bronner Hawk, is hurriedly prepared. Amazingly, the Hawk qualifies second quick, just a tick below pole sitter A.J. Foyt. On race day, Mario gets the early jump on Foyt and leads the first 5 laps. Lap 51 now, both Foyt and Andretti pit. AJ is out in 28 seconds, Andretti in 43. The lead is now Lloyd Ruby's. Ruby has charged from 20th to 1st in just 130 miles. It's the 3rd time in 4 years that he has led the 500-mile race. Lap 104, and race leader Mario Andretti comes in for his 2nd stop of the day. 2 laps later, Lloyd Ruby leads and makes his 2nd stop of the day. But Ruby inadvertently pulls out before the fuel hose is disconnected, ripping the side out of his car.
They told me to get out, and I still couldn't realize what happened. And I even got out and seen all the fuel running out. I got out and walked just a little ways and had to go back and look at it again. It seemed like I was having a nightmare.
With Ruby out, Andretti leads with ease, and on lap 153 makes his 3rd and final pit stop. Suddenly, Andretti's nearly into the wall, and Granatelli's heartbeat quickens. The final laps, and Andretti's lead over Dan Gurney is better than 2 laps. But something is wrong with Mario's car.
There was really no liquid oil lubrication in the gearbox left. And that's what I was really hearing, like the last 10 laps, everything just felt rough.
Mario Andretti takes the checkered flag in record time. The only time at Indianapolis that Andretti will ever call Victory Lane home.
I just wish every driver that ever set foot there could experience that, because it's a thrill of a lifetime.
So Mario wins in 1969. Before we talk about his win, though, let's talk about the fan favorite Lloyd Ruby, who had terrible luck at Indianapolis, and 69 was a perfect example of the things that he went through in his career.
Things happened every year. I think he led 5 out of 6 races in a period there, and each year you thought, as you're looking down the potential winners, please, surely this is Lloyd Ruby's year.
This has got to be his year. Yeah. Mario Andretti, only 1 win at Indy. Who would have thought that the champion who won IndyCar races galore and world championships would just win once here?
Especially since he ran so long. Parnelli Jones retired after only 7 races, and some others kind of premature retirements. But the fact that he would run so long, I mean, if you were in 1969 and thought, Mario's still going to be running 25 years from now and be competitive, but he's not going to win the 500 again.
Yeah. Well, the 1960s are history. We look toward 1970s now. What were the big changes that we saw in IndyCar racing in the 70s?
Well, the money. I mean, the aerodynamics, the wings came in the early 70s. The enclosed trailers started to show up, followed by the haulers. So coming in with a station wagon and a little open trailer, those days were gone.
That's for sure.
And then the motorhomes and the hospitality areas, it was to change a lot.
More like it is today.
Yeah.
Thanks for being with us on Decade of